Okay, how weird does it feel to be called someone's fiance? The first time you hear it, you do a double take. Your heart kind of flutters, and before you know it, you go from let's just enjoy the moment to we're planning a fall wedding. That's where Zola comes in. Zola has everything you need to plan your wedding in one place and have fun along the way. From free planning tools like a budget tracker and website to a venue and vendor discovery tool that matches you with your dream team. Everything on Zola is designed to make your wedding journey as easy as possible, and with invites that can be completely customized, and a wedding registry packed with gifts you actually want. Zola takes you from save our date to thanks so much without breaking a sweat. From getting engaged to getting married, Zola has everything you need to plan your wedding in one place. Start planning at Zola.com. That's ZOLA.com.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Show, episode 282. On today's show, I interview Laura Heath-Stout about her upcoming book, Identity, Oppression, and Diversity in Archaeology. Let's dig a little deeper. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. So joining us today is Laura Heath-Stout. Laura Heath-Stout is an intersectional feminist archaeologist and is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Archaeology Center at Stanford University. Her work focuses on how intersecting systems of oppression shape the demographics and knowledge production practices of archaeologists. Her new book, Identity, Oppression, and Diversity in Archaeology, comes out October 31st. Her next big project will be community-driven, disability justice-oriented study of a 20th century institution for people with intellectual disabilities in Massachusetts. Welcome to the show, Laura.
Thank you. I'm excited to be talking to you.
All right. So why don't you tell us about this new book of yours, and then we'll get into some questions.
Yeah. So the book is called Identity, Oppression, and Diversity in Archaeology, Career Arcs. It's coming out from Routledge at the end of October. And this is a project I've been working on since graduate school. It's growing out of my dissertation. And so I'm excited to have it out in the world much more. And so it's a sort of ethnographic study of archaeologists, looking at how systemic oppression of various intersecting sorts shapes who gets into archaeology in the first place, who pursues archaeology careers and what kind of experiences we have in our education and careers. And then the idea is to really get at what our demographics and issues with systemic oppression, how that affects the knowledge we produce about the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, we actually have talked about that quite a bit on this show, I would say, because, listeners to this show know that we talk about news stories and things in the field and current news articles, I should say. And there are quite a few news articles almost in the past year and a half, especially, where new research has come to light that shows that, hey, it turns out, women in prehistory didn't just sit around and sew and knit. They did hunt.
Imagine that.
they did do other things. Right. Turns out what we thought 60 years ago wasn't actually true.
Right. Right. And that's something that feminist archaeologists have been saying, at least in print, since the 80s. I'm sure they were, saying it to their buddies before that. But just saying, we shouldn't be projecting these sort of white American heterosexual middle class 1950s gender roles onto the Paleolithic or all of the human past, and then assuming that the men go out and do everything important and the women stay home with the kids, and then using that vision of the past to say, well, this is the natural way gender roles should be in the present. Right. But saying that in a journal doesn't necessarily mean that the stories about the past that the broader public is given access to reflect that insight, right?
Right. So we've probably got, if I had to guess, two amongst many, many, many other problems, but two really large problems, and correct me if I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. You've got a field that is dominated by, a lot of straight white men in leadership positions and doing different things. And that's, largely still true today. Mm-hmm. And But then you've got the problem of, okay, they're still in those positions, and they probably, you know, they're not gonna go anywhere unless they die or retire, right? So you've got that happening, and then you've got the other problem of, well, how do you either wait them out or re-educate them? And I'm talking about myself too, more than likely. And then also, you know, changing that, bringing diversity into the field, basically. But let's talk about the first problem, because that's an existing issue, right? How do you re-educate people into, you know, thinking about what they're finding and researching differently? That's such a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. Yeah. And you have, because of the power structures of the field, even if the majority of people in my generation, I'm a millennial, I'm 35, are women, or like the majority of the people I went to undergrad and grad school with were women, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people in gatekeeping positions of power are women. And that's actually been true for a while, that the majority of archaeology students are women, but that hasn't necessarily translated into the upper echelons of, you know, who is administering grants, or who is deciding who gets into PhD programs, or who is doing hiring at CRM firms, being women. And so, yeah, people call that the leaky pipeline effect, right? That there are like a lot more marginalized people at the beginning of the career path than at the end, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's naturally all going to change, just with time. And there are issues with the pipeline metaphor. The pipeline metaphor implies that like any given drop of water could leak out of the pipeline and is equally likely to leak out. And it doesn't really account for people actually mistreating each other in that metaphor, sort of pushing people out. But it's the most common metaphor there. But yeah, I think that there is growing pressure to change. I actually, in my interviews with archaeologists, saw there was a lot of discussion about this issue, particularly with regards to sexual harassment, because there was a lot of interviewees said like, oh yes, I was harassed by this like senior man, the director of my project, or the PI on my project, whatever. And then this sort of hope that it would like, but eventually all those guys will like retire or die or get in enough trouble that this stops. But I also heard from some of the young men I interviewed and some of the young queer women I interviewed about those senior men sort of inviting them to participate in harassment. So I had a couple of lesbian interviewees who went on projects where they had heard through, you know, the Whisper network that such and such an older man liked to hit on younger women. And so they were like, you know, like, hi, I'm a lesbian. I'm not available, like really proactively, like I'm not available. And then that same guy would engage them in conversation about like which of their colleagues they thought was most attractive. And they were like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. I did not mean I want to like join you as a harasser. I meant like, I'm unavailable here. Yeah. And similarly, I heard from some young men who had sort of been encouraged to pursue women who weren't really interested by senior men, and who were really disturbed by that. And it's hard to get a senior man who has a history of harassment to like talk into a microphone about it, but so I had to sort of triangulate here. But you can see how these issues would reproduce themselves as some of the more problematic people sort of socialize proteges to become them. And so I think we need to cut that off too. And so, but luckily there were also like the people I interviewed who told me these stories were horrified by this and said, no, I'm not doing that. And we're building a lot of communities with the people they were being encouraged to harass. And yeah, so it's my hope that there is some culture change happening. I also think that alongside larger movements that go well beyond archaeology, like Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a lot of energy in archaeology to change some of this. So I was involved in a project I was hired by the Wenner Gren Foundation, but they were working with a number of other major archaeology funders in order to try to understand the demographic dynamics of who gets archaeology research grants. And this group of staff members from different funding agencies had been meeting with members of the Society of Black Archaeologists and the Indigenous Archaeology Collective in order to sort of rethink their processes. And so there is hope. That's really hopeful to me that there are people who have so much power about over what research gets done and what doesn't, who are like, oh, we need to reflect on what we've been doing. We need to talk to marginalized people. We need to gather data about who's applying for grants, how people are choosing which grants to apply to, what their experiences are, and reflect on our processes to try to make them more fair. And I think that kind of thing will have ripple effects, because then when that person of color or woman or queer person or disabled person gets that Wenner-Gren grant or that whatever prestigious grant, that's going to boost their career, right? It's going to literally give them the money to allow them to do their research, but it's also a prestige thing. And so there are the sort of ripple effects of giving a boost to people doing interesting new research and bringing different perspectives to the research that will then affect what stories they tell or what questions they ask.
Indeed. It's such an interesting and hard question to answer, though, right? Because what's the right formula? What's the right percentage of people from different backgrounds and different, applying these grants and making these decisions? Like who decides what's the, what the right mix is? You know what I mean?
Right.
When do we say, oh, we've nailed it, that's the right mix?
Yeah. I've sometimes put numbers of demographic numbers of archaeologists alongside like US Census demographics, but that's not really is the goal to match the US population? Not especially, because archaeologists from the US work all over the world. So, and then the if you want the demographics of the archaeologists to match the demographics of the people they're studying, then you would only have Native American archaeologists studying pre-European contact archaeology. And that is not going to happen anytime soon. I'm not sure that should be the goal. I don't think it really should be. And even if it were the goal, that would be like a real stretch goal,
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to figure out how we would know that we've done it.
Yeah.
I think for me, I tend to think about our kids of all demographics and college students of all demographics being exposed to archaeology as a possible interest or career path. And then if they get interested, do they all have an equal opportunity to succeed? And the way it is right now, it's not equal. One of the chapters in my book is about recruitment of archaeologists, and there's a lot of class dynamics there that those of us like me who decided to be archaeologists when we were kids it's not surprising that I have that story and that I'm a middle-class white person, because my parents had time and inclination and education to read a ton of books to me, including historical fiction and things like that. And then when I got interested in archaeology, my mom is a children's librarian, and she found a kids archaeology magazine that's now defunct because media has changed so much. But there used to be this kids archaeology magazine called Dig. And then I learned from that about field schools that take high school students. And I had the privilege that I didn't have to work for money in the summer in high school. And beyond that, my parents had the money to pay for me to go on a field school and were willing to spend the money on that. And I think a lot of families would love to send their kids on a field school when they're 15, but just simply can't afford to.
Right.
And so you have all of these different ways that people come across archaeology as young people. The other big one is social studies curricula in schools, but because our schools are so beholden to standardized testing, and the standardized tests that get used to determine which school districts get what funding and whatever else rarely include social studies. It's all the reading and math. And so, of course, teachers are under huge pressure to teach the things that are tested. And then that leaves less space for language classes, foreign language classes, for social studies and history. And so then children who go to like wealthier school districts or private schools are more likely to get a really great like ancient history curriculum at some point than students who are going to a school that's like in danger of losing its funding if the math and literacy scores slip a tiny bit.
Right.
And so there's all these things about access. And then it's actually, I was interested to find that the people who discover archaeology in college were actually a much more diverse group, both in terms of race and socioeconomic background, since college is such a access to college is such a problem. But once you get to college, there were a lot of folks who discovered archaeology in college, and that was a much more diverse group. But then how do we make sure that people can access college, right? Yeah. And so my hope would be that like any young person is equally likely to like come across archaeology as a possible career and is equally likely to succeed. Mm-hmm. That would sort of be the bar that I've come to that I feel most comfortable with.
Okay. Yeah, that would be a good goal for sure. Okay. All right. Well, with that, let's take a break. And on the other side, we'll continue this discussion. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, episode 282. And we are talking with Laura Heath-Stout, and she's got a new book out. Check for the link in the show notes. You can pre-order it right now. If you're listening to this way into the future, just go buy it. But take a listen to the last segment. And if you're listening to this in disconnected fashion, but we are going to continue talking about this because I mentioned in the last segment that, we often do news articles on this show and we talk about how, things are looked at in a different light and people reanalyze stuff. And sometimes these ideas that were populated, 60, 70, 80 years ago turns out they're no longer true, and turns out they were probably never true. Right. And I'm just wondering if this research that was, put forth by, often, stodgy old men in the 60s, 50s, 40s, earlier, even 80s, 90s, who knows when, right? And they're saying all these theories, these gender-based theories, and that are now slowly, if not quickly, being proven false, and things are now coming to light, and new people are coming to the field with new ideas, and not even new ideas, but just ideas that are finally getting heard, right? And people are finally starting to listen. Is this research and these ideas that people have had and the way that they've treated people in the field and their own biases and things like that, can you see this when you've done research and people have done gender studies in these fields? Is it really just super obvious when you look back at the field and then you look at the papers and research people have done? And when you use hindsight to look at all that, is it just incredibly obvious, the research people have done, or do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah,
I don't understand. Yeah, I'm just trying to articulate this.
Yeah, I think that often the bias is really obvious, or the assumptions are really obvious. And then sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out how to prove that something different happened. So this happens a lot with, like, divisions of labor. Like, you can see in the archaeological record that certain tasks got done, but then figuring out who did which task can be really difficult. And so then, of course, we have like bioarchaeologists are sometimes able to tell from like muscle attachments and wear on people's bones that, this person did a lot of like this kind of work. I think the classic example is that blacksmiths have like one really bulky shoulder and one bulky shoulder, things like that. Or even with like disabled individuals in the past, then you can think about like which of the tasks that we know took place at this site would have been doable with this person's body and which ones wouldn't be. And then of course you have grave goods, but if someone's buried with certain things, does that mean that those were the things that belonged to them or had anything to do with what work they did? And then it's arguable, so it gets really tricky. And so that is a space where it's very easy to just make assumptions like, well, we know that someone went out and hunted and we know that there were kids that someone had to watch. And so we're just going to assume that the men went out and hunted and the women watched the kids.
Yeah.
And it's very hard. Like, well, we know that someone was butchering these animals and we know there were like tons of kids, especially like, pre-birth control. People had a lot of kids, even if some of them were dying young. And so like, it can be hard to break down those biases. And so you read some of this old research and you're like, well, why are you assuming that? But then it's very hard to say, oh, look, we have incontrovertible proof that this person with a really wide pelvis was like out doing the hunting, and this person with a really narrow pelvis was like watching kids. Like it's very difficult. So the bias is really obvious. But one of my favorite examples, I used to work in Aztec and colonial period central Mexico, and there's some great work by Lisa Overholzer and Kristen DeLucia about like childbirth and child rearing in Aztec Mexico at the site of Jaltocan. And I remember discovering some of those articles and being like, oh yeah, of course there are like tons of kids running around, and like we can think about what the kids are doing. And so in her article, Kristen DeLucia argues that some of these small fired clay representations of people should be thought of as dolls rather than figurines. And like, oh, duh, of course. But and she doesn't say in the article, like, well, because I'm a mom, I looked at these and was like, that looks like a toy. But she is a mom. She's fought a lot for like childcare at conferences and things like that. And as a mom myself, spending a lot of time with an almost 3-year-old, like it makes sense to me that I would look at like an Aztec household through a different lens than someone who doesn't have sort of primary responsibility for children, and that would shape how you would think about it. And so she also thinks about different activity areas in the house. And like, as someone who's thought a bunch about childproofing my house, if I were making obsidian tools in my living room, let me tell you that my 2-year and 10-month-old would not be allowed in here. And I would be thinking about that. And you can imagine that if you're not really like thinking about kids, either because you don't have kids or because you have a wife who is like the primary parent, you just wouldn't think about these things. And so you'd see these figurines and say like, oh, ritual, and just like miss that. Well, we actually have to disprove that they're toys in order to say that they're just like fancy ritual objects, right? We actually have to think about this. And so, and then Lisa Overholzer has an article about Aztec midwives in which she uses both the Florentine Codex, so a 16th century colonial period document, and archaeological evidence to like think about childbirth. And it's not so much that anyone was saying anything sexist or wrong about Aztec childbirth. It's just that no one was writing much about childbirth at all. And so it's not surprising to me that if you add more women, and especially women who have kids, to a discipline, to a subfield, a particular area of study, you're going to get these different interpretations. And then, I read those before I became a mom myself, but now that I'm a mom, I'm like, oh yeah, of course I would be thinking about that, because it's just in my brain all the time.
Yeah. Just thinking about kids and stuff like that, it's so amazing to me how much, and so obvious too, how much bias really influences you as an archaeologist. And because, I've been a serum archaeologist for a long time, and there's 3 things I can think of that really just kind of always sit in my head. And one of them is, when we first worked because my wife is a serum archaeologist too, everybody who listens to this podcast knows that. And when we started working in Nevada for the first time, which was early in both of our careers, we got over there and we were shovel bums. We've been living out of our car for probably a year at that point, maybe longer by the time we got to Nevada, just going job to job. And when we got there, we started working for a couple of companies, and there had been people that had been working at those companies for a long time, or at least in the Great Basin, if not just out of the Reno offices forever. Right. And they maybe even went to school there, and they had no concept of shovel bumps. They had no concept of like working, across the country and doing this, and just didn't even know that was a thing. And were floored by the fact that there were other ways to do archaeology and to do this thing, and that there were different types of site records than the Nevada IMAX form. And there were different ways to record archaeological sites. And it was just amazing to me that they even thought that way. And later on in my life, when I started working with digital site records and working across different countries, I worked in 18 different states, and I was like trying to think of a national like site form type of a thing. And you know, having people tell me there's no such way to do that. And I'm like, yeah, but everybody records sites the same way. You just don't realize you do, right? They're all kind of the same thing. You just have different terms for stuff. And but people don't realize that because of their own biases. And then I went to, when I just got out of college, I went to Africa. I went to Olduvai Gorge and worked there on a Earthwatch project because that's the only way I could get there. And I remember seeing Maasai kids. They had spears. They were probably, you know, they didn't get to go with the teenagers and do the fun stuff. They had to watch the sheep. And they considered it really boring, but there was like 2 or 3 of them that they would put. And the youngest was maybe 4 or 5 years old. And they were paired with, you know, the experienced ones who were maybe 7 or 8. And there was these 3, they were just walking around with like a herd of sheep, you know, young to older sheep, and just, you know, around the savannah. I'm sure somebody was probably not too far away that, you know, we couldn't see them, but there was somebody probably not too far away that was within probably earshot or something. Maybe not. But they were basically on their own in the savannah, you know, lions and elephants and who knows what about. And they're just off doing their job. You know what I mean? And that's so different than the way it is here. And I can't imagine what it was like even a few hundred, if not a few thousand years ago.
Right.
Yeah. It's just amazing. But people who don't have those experiences and see those things and just live in Victorian England or something like that might not even be able to interpret that, you know, let alone live in suburban Reno or something, you know? So.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, we tend to underestimate how much of our culture is specific to a very particular time and place. And so you just like, you think you know what childhood is, or like, what does it mean to be a 4-year-old?
Yeah.
And like, what it means to be a 4-year-old actually varies enormously across time and space and culture. And yep. And in fact, I think our culture is even changing about like how much freedom kids have. And it, of course, that varies geographically too, but like how much do you like when my mom was a kid, she would go out and play on the street with her friends, and her mom didn't necessarily like know exactly where she was all the time, and she just had to be home for dinner. And then my mom sort of did that with me as a kid in the 90s, and acquaintances would like see me riding my bike around town and call my mom and be like, do you know where Laura is? You know, she's over by my house. And my mom was like, yeah, she said she'd be back by dinner. And I feel like she's fine. She's fine. She has a watch. She knows how to get around. Like, she's fine. But like, that was a little bit out. We were out of step with the culture of the suburb where I grew up by doing that. And then, you know, now I think that's even more rare for my kids' generation. And so it's changing. We can see it change over the course of, you know, the living memories of people in our families. And yet we still think like, oh, this is what a 7-year-old is like. And then you see that Maasai 7-year-old shepherd and you're like, oh, wait, what? That kid has not only like not necessarily freedom, but like a huge amount of responsibility that is very different from most 7-year-olds in the US.
Yeah, huge. So, all right, well, let's take our final break and we'll come back and wrap up this discussion on the other side. Back in a minute.
Need a little help? O'Reilly Auto Parts can help. Need advice? We've got advice. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Exceptional customer service. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
O'Reilly.
Need a little help? O'Reilly Auto Parts can help. Need advice? We've got advice. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Exceptional customer service. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, episode 282, and we are wrapping up this discussion with Laura Heath-Stout. So I want to just kind of wrap this up with your book and maybe some conclusions you've come up to. So, I mean, how do we solve all these problems without overcorrecting? You know what I mean? Because you did mention, when you were coming up in say, in college and undergrad and beyond, you had a lot of women in your classes. And to be honest, I did too, now that I'm thinking about it. How do we balance? You know what I mean? We don't want to overcorrect by any means. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what that would look like. But how do we balance out and teach people and just end up in a good place?
Yeah.
Do we even know the answer to that question? No pressure.
I think there's a lot of work to be done. And in fact, the last chapter of my book is like almost all suggestions for different people. Yeah. Just like lots of different things that you can do. And a lot of those are drawn from my interviews. So if I have an interviewee who has a particular like negative experience and they thought about quitting archaeology, and then such and such a friend or a mentor like really supported them in certain ways, I think about like, what does that support look like and who might be able to offer that support to someone in a similar position. Like we actually can learn from each other. We don't all have to like just look at these problems and be overwhelmed. There are actually a lot of people who either through like really like louder activism and organizing, or just through, trying to treat their colleagues and students well, are making a difference, and we can sort of learn from each other. I don't necessarily see that like we're getting anywhere close to overcorrection as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I think that to me, like if the demographics shift, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an injustice happening. So to me, the problem would be like an overcorrection in gender, for example, would be if a lot of the people in positions of power, the owners and the leaders of CRM firms and the like directors of the museums and the professors and the grant makers were all women. Then my question would be like, well, are men equally likely to get jobs? Are men equally likely to get grants? Are men equally likely to like if the demographics shift, but there's not necessarily an injustice happening, I wouldn't worry about it that much. But I also just think we're far enough from that point that
not a problem yet.
I'm not that worried. Yeah, but I do think that there's sort of work for everyone to be doing. So the people in positions of power, of course, have responsibility here, but anyone who is a member of a professional organization can join committees in that professional organization, for example. And so there are inequities like a lot of the people on committees related to diversity and equity or related to like giving scholarships to marginalized students or things like that tend to be from the marginalized communities. And so there's this like labor that isn't really valued a lot of the time that's being put on certain groups. So like when I was on the SAA's meeting safety committee, which was focused on like sexual harassment policy around the conferences. And we were almost all women in the time I was there. And we were almost all young women who did not have permanent employment, actually. And we were like, actually, people who are much more stable than us and have more privilege than us could also be doing this work. And so as we sort of, I was in the sort of first generation of that committee. And as we thought about whom to ask to join, we actually were like, oh, let's not just think about the like angry fellow 28-year-old women who are in grad school that we know. Like, let's think about the like lovely men with stable jobs that we know who we think like maybe aren't lining up to join this committee because they, for whatever reason, but like actually could be doing some good work here.
Right.
Like the Native American Scholarships Committee doesn't have to be all Native American archaeologists, right?
Sure.
And so there's this work to be done. There's also things that like even students can do. Students can ask the chairs of their departments or their advisors for resources. So if you're like, I went to a graduate program that was just 100% focused on academic career paths, even though academic career paths that actually pay a living wage are like becoming rarer and rarer all the time. And my best buddy from grad school and I just were like, oh, there should be professional development opportunities that have something to do with any other career path that you could have with a master's or a PhD in archaeology. And so we were in charge of running the weekly lecture series one year, and we put together some panels where we got like the city archaeologist of Boston and folks who did CRM and folks who worked for the Park Service who were archaeologists to come and like tell us what they did with their days. People who were not archaeology professors, and nobody we were not struck by lightning for suggesting that there might be careers that you might want to do that are not a tenure track professor. It felt a little nerve wracking at the time because it felt like breaking this taboo, but we felt that we had very little power in the department, but we took the thing that we were given, which was here, run this lunchtime talk series. And we were like, well, what do we want to hear about? Let's figure out who can talk to us about that. So I think that there are things that can be done by sort of anyone in archaeology. If you're seeing a problem in your workplace or in your school, you can actually think about that. If you're organizing a panel for a conference or organizing a podcast, and you can think about who you're asking to be on the panel. And if, is everyone that I'm inviting on this panel white? Is there anyone who's a person of color who's doing this work who would have something to contribute? Maybe I should invite them. Like there are all these little tiny opportunities in everything we do that we should just be keeping our eye out for small things that we can do to like boost marginalized people and support each other in our careers. And I think that, it doesn't always look like a big heroic thing to do, but even those of us who are not like deciding who gets the big grant actually can throw a little effort into this work, I think.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, this sounds like definitely worth reading for sure. And I think you said when we were talking about this, that this comes out in hardback and paperback as well. So makes it affordable because these books can be a little pricey sometimes. So definitely take a look at that, but it'll be available for pre-order at the link, as I mentioned in the show notes. So go ahead and take a look at that. I mean, any final thoughts on this? Cause I'm just thinking, sometimes books like this come out or papers like this come out, or you see papers or panels at conferences and things. And to be honest, the right people aren't in the room. You know what I mean? And I don't even know if they're listening to the show, to be honest with you. And I don't know how to get the message to them. And sometimes they just have to kind of exit peacefully, and then everybody else just kind of comes up along behind them. But maybe that's what has to happen. But any final thoughts or anything like that on where you're kind of going from here?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to reach like the people who most need it. I felt when I was interviewing people, I was like, man, I wish I could figure out how to interview some of the like more problematic actors in the field, but like they didn't want to talk to me on a microphone.
Right.
And so, it can be hard to figure out how to reach them. I tend to focus on reaching people who are sort of in the in-between, who are maybe not necessarily like, ooh, here's a panel on queer issues in archaeology. I will definitely go to that, but also aren't like actively bullying all the queer people they know. There's like a huge middle ground there of people who are just like busy with what they're busy with and not really going far in either direction, who can be invited and say, like, you could say like, oh, as a queer person, I have said to like, just straight friends at conferences who are not plugged into like, oh, what is this queer session about? Just like, oh, look, I'm really excited for this. And I really think that like everyone has something to learn about how to support their queer colleagues, and had people come like, oh yeah, I could go to that. Because you look at these conference programs and they're enormous. Like, how do you choose? And so you can exert a little bit of like positive peer pressure there on the people in the middle. I do think there are people like, some of the people who have been fired or forced into retirement for abusing generations of grad students. I don't have much hope for like converting them. But I think that there are people who are just like not super engaged with these issues who would be happy to learn a little bit about them if they were invited in. And I tend to focus my effort on those people so that we can grow the percentage of us who are thinking about these issues until it becomes very unusual to not care, sort of.
Nice. Well said. All right. Well, that's a good point to end on. Laura, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I hope everybody goes out and buys a copy of your book.
I appreciate that.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to The Archaeology Show. Feel free to comment and view the show notes on the website at www.archpodnet.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ArchPodNet. Music for this show is called I Wish You Would Look from the band Sea Hero. Again, thanks for listening and have an awesome day. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.